Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all so much for being here. What a treat this is for me this evening. I'm no stranger to introducing people as they're doing these things, but tonight I get to introduce my husband as the guest speaker. I think that's just about as good as it gets. This is a wonderful series that we've been doing here at the museum. And it was started and it is completely organized by this amazing woman to my right, Jennifer LeGrand. So a big round of applause for Jennifer. She and her assistant Maggie have done a remarkable job at putting together these evenings. And I would encourage you, if you're not a member of the museum, to think about becoming a member, because it's through your membership that you really do find out about everything that's going on here. And this is just one in a long series of events that we do. So I'm going to just put a big plug in for everybody being a museum member. And I have to think that we probably have the best museum membership perk of any museum, because if you're a member of the Cowgirl Museum, it allows you to be granted entry to the stock show grounds every day of the rodeo, every day of the stock show. So that's a pretty big plus that goes with your Cowgirl membership. So as I'm looking out in the audience tonight, I recognize so many faces, and I know that so many of you know Kelly. And thank you for coming out and not only supporting the museum, but supporting this amazing talk that he's giving tonight. I think if you know Kelly at all, you know two things about him. He is an amazing storyteller. This guy can tell a story with the best of them, and the best of them was actually his father, Lanham, but he's right up there with him. And the other thing about Kelly is he is so passionate about rodeo and rodeo history. And as you listen to him talk this evening, you'll really understand why, because it's his DNA. So we're really fortunate to have a speaker this evening who knew Tad Lucas not only as the great rodeo icon that she was, but as his grandmother. That's pretty darn special. I've always thought that Kelly was a real culmination of all of his family members. But I think that of all of them, he reminds me the most of his grandfather, Buck Lucas, who you'll hear some things about tonight. And it was really funny because our niece, Bonnie, who got married in June, is here this evening with her new husband, Walker. And Kelly had the honor of walking her down the aisle. And so he was wearing his tuxedo, and he spent hours looking at videos trying to figure out how to tie a bow tie. And he practiced and practiced and practiced. And now Kelly Riley, as you can also imagine with Kelly, he can tie a bow tie perfectly and is taken to wearing them. And I thought, well, what is this whole thing about you wanting to wear bow ties? And as he was doing his research and we were looking at pictures of his family, we came across a picture of his grandfather, Buck Lucas, wearing a bow tie. So I thought, well, that just brings it all together for me. So it's with great love and honor, I'd like to introduce tonight's speaker, Kelly Riley, my husband.
I'm very fortunate to be married to my best friend. Pat, thank you for being my wife and for being here at the National Cowgirl Museum. And a heartfelt thanks to Jennifer LeGrand and Maggie Terry for organizing the Cowgirl Connection. And to Bethany Dodson, who unfortunately is not here tonight, but she helped me to organize this presentation. And she did a terrific job. Better? Yeah. Good? Okay. Good evening, everyone, and I'm really pleased that you're here. The world knew Tad Lucas as a great cowgirl and a rodeo icon, and of course, I knew her as my grandmother. In the early 1900s, women were considered a little too fragile and too delicate for sports, and their career choices were limited. Teachers, factory workers, domestic servants. But Tad Lucas and her fellow cowgirls played a large part in changing those stereotypes. Wild West shows and rodeos were a way for women to earn a living. They could earn more money in rodeos than they could at traditional jobs. And these spunky cowgirls proved that women were strong, smart, and capable. Like Tad, they can follow their dreams. This photo is really great because that's Tad and her favorite horse, Candyland. And then, of course, some of the trophies that she won. But we'll hear more about Candyland later. Barbara Inez Barnes was born on September 1st in 1902 in Cody, Nebraska. To put 1902 in perspective, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Arizona weren't even states then. 95% of childbirths were at home. There was only 144 miles of paved roads in the United States, and Theodore Roosevelt was the president. Tad's father, Lorenzo Barnes, he's the gentleman, he's the gentleman in the lower center with the beard. He was really an interesting character. He was born in Ohio in 1837. He married Eliza Jane Hall in 1856, and they had 14 children. We think some of them died fairly early. He joined the Illinois 7th Regiment Infantry and fought in the Civil War. And one of his favorite memories was shaking President Abraham Lincoln's hand. After the war, he moved to Nebraska, and he was the first Anglo settler in Cherry County. He had a trading post, and he traded horses with the Native Americans, and he freighted goods for settlers that were moving west. His wife, Eliza, died in 1886. In 1888, he married Hannah Gartside Miller, and she was from the next town over, Gordon, Nebraska. Hannah is the lady on the, I guess that would be the right, in the glasses. They had 10 children, and Tad was the last. So Tad was the last of 24 children. Lorenzo nicknamed her Tadpole because she could slither across the floor at a rapid pace. Later the pole was dropped and she became known as Tad. Lorenzo donated land for the school and the Episcopal Church in Cody, Nebraska. He lived to be 85 years old. I think I got ahead of myself. Okay, from childhood, Tad loved horses, and she had access to a lot of them from her father's business. Now that's Tad with the bows in her hair, with a little white blouse. She would ride with the Native Americans from the nearby Rosebud Reservation, and at age 12, she would ride steers on Saturday afternoons on Main Street of Cody to raise money for the Red Cross because World War I was in progress. Her brother Mick, and that's Mick on the right there, he was her favorite, and he thought she could ride anything. So one day this fellow brings a bronchi horse to the Saturday afternoon sessions, and Mick said, "Tad can ride him." So they throw a saddle on him. Of course, the stirrups were too long, and he promptly bucked Tad off. About that time, her dad, Lorenzo, comes walking around the corner and saw the incident, and he sent Tad home. But that didn't deter Tad's desire to be a cowgirl. Yeah, I also want to point out Tad's sister, Mildred. She's the lady with the bow. Tad called her Billy, and they were lifelong friends. At the age of 15, Tad went to the county fair in Gordon, with her brother Mick to ride racehorses. Well, there was a famous cowgirl there named Mildred Douglas, and the fair management organized a steer riding contest between Mildred and Tad. So this is Mildred. Mildred rode first, and she got bucked off. Tad rode next, and she completed her ride and won $25. So she was hooked. In 1919, Tad and her sister Billy left Cody, and they moved to El Paso, Texas. Now, Tad never talked too much about this, but she married a rancher there by the name of Frank Joseph Williams, and they had a daughter, Dorothy, that year, but the marriage was very short-lived. Tad and Billy joined the Sells Floto Circus and went on the road to Mexico, and the poster on the right there is from the Sells Floto Circus. Buffalo Bill Cody actually performed with the Sells Floto Circus in 1914 and 1915. They did all sorts of circus jobs. They rode elephants. They did Wild West stunts. They cleaned up. In 1920, Tad, Dorothy, and Billy made their way here to Fort Worth. And she attended the Fort Worth Rodeo and the Coliseum and the Stockyards. And Tad there saw her very first trick riding contest. And of course, she was fascinated. Later, in 20 or 20, I guess 21, she joined the California Frank Halfley Wild West show and went back to Mexico. Now, when you were walking in to the museum, you passed under Mamie Halfley and her Arabian horse, Lurleen. Mamie was Frank Halfley's wife, and she was a famous Wild West performer known for jumping her horse from a tower into a pool of water. Now this, let's see. Yeah, this photo is Frank Halfley's Wild West show. It's down in Mexico. That's Mamie on the white horse waving her hat, and that's Tad behind her horseback. At these Wild West shows, Tad would ride a Brahma stag every day, and then she also rode Brahma. This is Green Halfley Shelton with Tad. Green was Mamie's daughter, and she was learning to trick ride. They had a group of Russian Cossacks with this Wild West show. And Green and Tad became fast friends, and Green encouraged Tad to study with these Cossacks as well and learn to trick ride. And so Tad's trick riding career was on its way. That's a picture of them, of course, in front of the dining tent there in Mexico. Tad stayed on with Colonel Frank and performed at fairs and expositions in the eastern part of the United States. That was really a stepping stone for her to enter her first Madison Square Garden rodeo as a bronc rider in 1923. A little side story about Tad in Mexico. She bought a parrot in the train station at Juarez, and she smuggled it across the border in her blouse. And so she named this parrot Polly, and he was part of the family for 45 years. Now, I always tried to be a friend of Polly's, but whenever I would scratch his head, he'd bite me. So he only liked Tad. In 1924, Tad's reputation and career was growing, and that year was also a turning point in her professional life. So in March, again at the Fort Worth Rodeo in the old Coliseum, Tad was riding a bronc, and the pickup man was late getting there. So this handsome cowboy was down in the arena, and he saw what was happening. He saw Tad was about to take a nasty spill. So he ran out and caught her in his arms just as this bronc bucked her off. That's a pretty novel way to meet your future wife. Buck and Tad got married in May 23rd, in New York City. And they boarded the steamship Menominee with 160 other cowgirls, cowboys, and livestock to go with Tex Austin to London, England to perform in the Wild West show in Wembley Stadium. This is a great picture of some of the cowgirls on the ship Menominee. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about Buck. he was quite a story in his own right. You know, he was born in Nebraska too, in Omaha. He moved to California when he was a young man, and he learned the cowboy trade working on ranches and farms. He joined the military, and he fought in the trenches in France in World War I. When he came back from the war, he returned to California, and he worked for the silent film actor William S. Hart, who became very famous for his westerns. As you can see, Buck was a champion bronc rider and a steer wrestler. He was the champion steer wrestler at the Penalty Roundup in 1924. So this is fun. Here's some footage of Buck steer wrestling at the Deadwood, South Dakota Rodeo, probably in the 30s. And I want you to note two things. The size of the steer and the fact that Buck jumped from the right-hand side because he was left-handed. All right, this is Buck at Deadwood. You can see the size of the steer. And he has to twist him around, and actually this is called a half Nelson. He has to put a half Nelson on this steer and throw it. Sorry about the delay. You know, back to Buck and Tad. So they're on their honeymoon in London. And I read that the very first performance at Wembley Stadium drew 92,000 people. Now, I was a little skeptical about that, but here's a picture of a photo of the crowds, and you can see there were a lot of people there. Another side story to Buck. At Wembley, he had just finished wrestling this steer. And he was standing down by the chutes, and this dapperly dressed gentleman came walking down, and he found Buck, and he said, I want to shake the hand of a real man. And Buck said, well, you know, great, let's shake hands. And by the way, what's your name? He said, Rudyard Kipling. So Buck said, well, you know, I enjoy reading your works. And Buck ended up being the champion steer wrestler at this Wembley competition. Now, we've got some footage here, if I don't screw it up, of Tad riding a bronc at Wembley. Okay, this is Wembley Stadium. And this is Tad riding a bronc. So she did that every day. You know, when they got back from London, Buck and Tad settled on some acreage in the country just west of Fort Worth in what is now River Oaks. Fort Worth was known as a hub for many famous cowgirls and cowboys. Cowgirls like Bee Kernan, Reen Halfley Shelton, Ruth Roach, and Mabel Strickland all lived here in Fort Worth. Buck built her a fine barn and an arena for Tad to practice her tricks in. You know, early on in their marriage, Buck was smart enough to understand that Tad was the star. She was the celebrity. So he scaled back his rodeo competition, and he became Tad's manager. And believe you me, she needed one. Tad was a socializer, and Buck was not. Buck kept her horses in shape. He designed and took care of her costumes, and he always made sure that everything was ready for her to perform. In 1928, Tad and Buck had a daughter, Mitzi. She was born prematurely, January 10th, at Harris Methodist Hospital here, and she only weighed 2 pounds, 14 ounces. So she was the youngest baby to survive at that time. Tad and Buck put her in a shoebox lined with cotton, brought her home in the snow and cold, and she made it just fine. Mitzi would travel with Buck and Tad in the summers, but her Aunt Billy kept her when she started school. Now, this is a famous picture of Mitzi and Tad's hat when she took her to the rodeo in Fort Worth to show her off to her fans. You know, Tad competed in 3 events, as did most of the cowgirls in the 20s and 30s. Bronc riding, trick riding, and if the rodeo facility had a track, they had relay racing. The bronc riding and trick riding events were competitions. They were judged. So these photos show Tad performing her famous back drag at the Fort Worth Rodeo, and that's her horse Kitty. There she is riding a bronc in her woolly chaps, and that's her relay racing. Of course, that's Tad in front. All right, if I can do this is some really fun footage of Tad trick riding at Deadwood on her horse Candyland, and then we'll also see her doing a relay race. So I want you to notice how fast Candyland runs. That's what she really loved about him. I don't know if I told you, but she bought him from a steer wrestler in Cheyenne. They were at Cheyenne Frontier Days. She bought this horse, he was 6, and she thought she'd ride him in the parade. So she takes him to the parade and rides him. Well, she starts back to the Frontier Grounds, which was 3 miles away, and he ran off with her. He ran the entire way. So, and she couldn't get him stopped. He shifted the bit over to the side of his mouth. So she got there and she said, "I'm never riding this horse again." But of course, Candyland became her favorite horse. This is Ted doing it's a shoulder stand and some vaults. By the way, we have a couple of trick riders here. Butch Morgan, he trick rode at Fort Worth, so he'll enjoy this.
58 years ago.
Tad doing a vault. That is not Tad. Now here's Tad in the relay race. So I want you to notice how quickly she can change mounts. They had to make 3 laps, change horses twice. So here she comes. You know, the Cowgirls were becoming so popular that some significant special awards were created. As a tribute to the charm and courage of Western women, in 1927, the Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer Studios commissioned a $10,000 trophy to be awarded to the all-around champion cowgirl at the Madison Square Garden Rodeo, which was the cowgirl that won the most money in 2 events. Florence Randolph won the all-around title there in 1927. Then Tad won it 3 consecutive years, 28, 29, and 30. Under sponsor rules, if the trophy was won 3 times, it had to be retired. So Tad took sole possession of it. For years, Tad just had this trophy in her living room. You know, I'd go over and visit her, and to me, it's just another trophy. Unfortunately, it's not on display here. But you can see it at the National Cowboy Museum in Oklahoma City. I wish it was here. Tad won the all-around championship at Madison Square Garden 6 times. She won the trick riding championship at Cheyenne twice and the relay race 3 times. I think she won 8 championships at Cheyenne. And she was the trick riding champion 3 times in Chicago and won 2 all-around championships there. She won 4 trick riding championships here at Fort Worth. And that's Eamon Carter presenting her a trophy for one of her wins. From 1924 to about 1935, Tad was winning between $8,000 and $10,000 a year, which was more than any cowboy won. In today's economy, that'd be about $223,000. This is one of the reasons she's known as the First Lady of Rodeo. You know, Tad was a celebrity, and she hung out with celebrities. At Wembley in 24, she performed before the Prince of Wales and the Queen of Spain. In 1927 at Belfouche, South Dakota, she performed in front of President Calvin Coolidge and his wife. From her time in New York City, she personally knew the boxer Jack Dempsey. She'd go to his restaurant all the time. And the baseball great Babe Ruth. She was a friend of Will Rogers, Roy Rogers, and Gene Autry. And of course, she was a favorite of Eamon Carter here in Fort Worth. This photo is interesting. It shows Tad between 2 celebrities of her time. That's Cecil B. DeMille's daughter, Catherine, on her right, and on the left is the famous ballerina, Madame Bovie. In 1929, women's contest events took a setback when Bonnie McCarroll was killed in a bronc riding accident at the Pendleton Roundup. Now, this is a photo of Bonnie at Pendleton, but this isn't the fatal accident, but I'm sure it was pretty serious. 1929 was also the year that the Rodeo Association of America was formed to help organize rodeo competitions. This was a group made up of rodeo committees and individual promoters. And really, honestly, by that point in time, they weren't very interested in women having contest events. And then you had the Depression going on and World War II just right around the corner. So those were all factors in pushing women's contest events aside. In 1932, Tad and Buck's home burned in River Oaks just a few days before Christmas. She lost all these trophies and those beautiful saddles. But, Buck, being the guy he was, he built an apartment in the barn where they lived, and then built a new home that was finished in 1933. 1933 was a critical year for Tad. She was performing her famous under the belly of her horse at full speed trick at the Chicago World's Fair at Soldier Field. And she caught her arm with a hoof. She was riding Candyland and had a compound fracture. I mean, it was a terrible break. She got infected with gangrene. The doctors wanted to amputate her arm. But of course, Tad would have none of that. And she wore a cast for almost 4 years. Here is Tad and Mitzi discussing her accident.
Turning me with his feet to his brother's back. When it's crushed on, I can't turn there. He worked so many cast almost 4 years.
Ted's daughter Mitzi was 5 years old at the time.
It was the show must go on that thing. My mother broke her arm and she had an old summer school contract she broke at the World's Fair. And she taught me a few little tricks.
Mitzi became quite an accomplished performer in her own right.
Tad had a brother who worked for the Navajo Nation and in Arizona. And a Navajo woman made Tad a very unique silver and turquoise bracelet to hide the scar. And you can see it in this gallery over here. It's really pretty cool. 1933 was also pretty much the end of contest trick riding. So by the time Tad came back, about 1936, trick riding had become an exhibition. In 1936 was also important here because it was the Texas Centennial. And both Dallas and Fort Worth had planned extravagant celebrations. This is the program from the celebration over in Dallas, which was at Fair Park. Tad was working for Colonel W.T. Johnson, and he was producing that show in Dallas, so that's where she performed. Amon Carter was not going to be outdone by Dallas. So he produced his own show right here on these grounds. And 8-year-old Mitzi and her dad, Buck, performed in the Last Frontier Wild West show over here at the original Casa Manana. So that's a picture of Mitzi with Amon Carter, and that I think that's her credential to get in. After the Centennial finished, Tad still worked for Colonel W.T. Johnson. They got on his train here in Fort Worth and went to Madison Square Garden in New York. About that time, the Cowboys had become kind of fed up with Colonel W.T. Johnson because he wasn't adding their entry fees to the prize money. And so they told him at Madison Square Garden that Hugh Bennett and Everett Bowman were organizing the Cowboys. And they told Colonel Johnson, hey, if you don't add our entry fees to the prize money at the next rodeo in Boston, we're going to strike. Colonel Johnson, he was a very successful promoter. He a very proud guy. And so they went on to Boston, and he didn't add the prize entry fees to the prize money. So the Cowboys did strike. And poor Colonel Johnson, he had to round up anybody he could find to ride broncs, bulls, and bulldog steers that first rodeo performance. And of course, it was a disaster. So he ended up giving in to their demands and adding entry fees, to their prize money. And that's when the Cowboys Turtle Association was formed. that they named it the Cowboy Turtle Association because they were so slow to stick their neck out and demand changes. Oh, by the way, that's Colonel Johnson in the middle with some of his cowgirls. Tad and Buck, of course, they were there at Boston and amid all this controversy, but they didn't sign the original Turtles agreement because, they were afraid that Colonel Johnson would terminate her contract. But she did later become a turtle, and that's a picture of her turtle pen. In 1939, Tad was invited along with several other top cowboys and cowgirls to participate in the Royal Easter Show in Sydney, Australia. February 1st, she departed from Long Beach on the ship Mariposa. They had stops in Honolulu, Samoa, and New Zealand before they got to Sydney. They didn't take livestock with them, just their tack and costumes. And when Tad got there, she had to train her trick riding horse, which proved to be quite a task. So she and her fellow trick rider, Trixie McCormick, were sent out to this isolated station to train their trick riding horses. They were out there for 3 weeks. They were homesick. They were miserable. There were flies. There were mosquitoes. And, of course, no company. But they finally got their horses trained. And she performed very well. And she was sure glad to get back to the United States. I happen to have Tad's diary from that trip. And this is actually the pencil that she wrote with. So this is a pretty good read, and I'm going to give it to the museum, of course. So Tad and Mitzi, they performed as a duo during and after the war years. Their act was like a well-oiled machine. Tad can only perform certain tricks, after she'd had that arm injury. So Mitzi was able to fill in with some exciting and technically difficult tricks for their act. Mitzi got married in 1947, married Lanham, but Tad and Mitzi continued to perform together into the 50s. Tad made one last foray overseas to Brussels, Belgium. The World's Fair was being held there in 1958, and some California promoters decided that it would be a great idea to have a separate Wild West show. So you can see the headlines from the New York Times. Wild West show in Brussels Rodeo for World's Fair will be held in plastic tent. Well, Goodyear had designed this huge inflatable tent for the rodeo. It collapsed. They were never able to get it up. It down in a hole. It was muddy. And, they had a fine trip over there, but once they got there, everything went sour. They weren't being paid. They didn't have a place to stay. It was just a disaster. So you can see the second headline, Wild West Show folds in Brussels. 250 performers and Indians stranded at the fair. U.S. is trying to pay their debts. Tad and her fellow cowboys and cowgirls actually had to sneak into the facility and steal their tack back because it had been impounded. So they were able to do it. Well, the United States, they sent a plane to fly them back. But it was a plane that had been used to ferry Hungarian refugees. So Tad said it was not a very nice trip back. They flew back to New York City. Gene Autry met them there. He'd heard about all this. He took them out to dinner, and then he paid their way to Denver. And then Tad rode the train from Denver here, and I can remember going with Buck and Mitzi to pick Tad up. And she was pretty glad to be back. By the way, Tad, one of only a handful that paid the United States for her ticket back. Tad finished her career trick riding alongside Mitzi. In that fall, 1958, the Huntsville prison used to have a rodeo every weekend in October. And Tad and Mitzi loved to perform there. The inmates would do the riding events. So they went there in 1958 and performed. I was there with them. I was about 10 years old. Right after that, Tad said she was retiring because her trick riding horse was too old and she didn't want to train another one. Yeah, at that time, Tad was 56. You know, even though Tad and Buck separated in 1936 and divorced in 41, he remained deeply in love with her, and he was never very far away. He built her several rental properties in River Oaks, and Tad became the landlady. So now we've learned about Tad's incredible rodeo career, so I'd like to share just a couple of personal stories with Tad as my grandmother. My dad used to take me with him in the summertime to rodeos, and I think it was the summer of 55. We ended up in Cheyenne Frontier Days, and I had to get back for school. Well, Tad was there, and she had her horse Pumpkin, her trick riding horse, and she was staying with Gretchen Elliott, who was Vern Elliott's wife. By the way, Gretchen was one of Houdini's assistants when she was a young woman. She was a striking woman. So Tad loaded me and Pumpkin up one afternoon in Cheyenne. She drove straight through to Fort Worth. She ran out of fuel just a little east of Jacksboro. You know, it's like 4 a.m. I'm asleep in the back seat. She had a 56 Pontiac. And she got out. She said, "Don't worry, I'll be back." She hitched a ride back into Jacksboro, found some fuel, and, you know, came back, fueled up. We drive into her place in River Oaks just at sunup. She unloads Pumpkin, feeds him, goes in the house and fixes breakfast. I mean, that was Tad. And then I stayed with her, I think in 56, I was in the first grade, and Lanham and Mitzi were competing at Madison Square Garden in Boston. So Tad would take me to school every day. Well, we had a routine. We'd get up, we'd go out to the ranch between Azle and Lake Worth. We'd feed the horses, feed the dogs. She'd come back, drop me off at school, and she'd pick me up, and we'd go to, back into River Oaks, and we'd go out to her barn, and Tad always had chickens. She had at that time, she had a ram, a sheep with a ewe, and the ewe had a little lamb. And of course, she had her horses. So she had fed these sheep in the hallway of the barn. Well, I wanted to be a roper, so I had this little cotton rope, and I'd rope everything. So I saw this ram eating, his back was to me. So I snuck up and I roped him. I actually caught him. Unlike the calves that my dad roped that went to the other end of the rope, he came straight at me and ran. So the ram has me down, and Tad came around the corner and rescued me. So I'll always remember that. And, Tad was really a good cook. And she always had these chickens, and I can remember she'd just be walking around, and there'd be a young pullet there, and she'd grab that pullet, wring its neck, feathers are off, clean it, and we'd have fried chicken. Just, nothing for Tad. Every evening, Billy, who just lived right up the street, she had some rental properties too. She'd walk down to Tad's house, and there was a little porch there in the backyard, and they'd have a cocktail. Tad would bring Polly the parrot out, hang him on a tree limb, and they would reminisce about past times. And I got to experience so many of those, and that was really terrific for me to hear about their life. I was really fortunate to know Tad, and my great lifelong appreciation for rodeo and its history is a tribute to her. So thank you very much.